Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a nice fall Friday. It's beautiful outside today. I am so happy to be here with you today for the 2021 Watershed Congress. Of course, I would love to see you all at Montgomery County Community College, but this is just as good, right? This is Friday, day 5 of our virtual Watershed Congress, and we're so happy you're here. The Watershed Congress is organized by the Delaware River. Sorry, guys. It's Friday. Delaware Riverkeeper Network. In collaboration with many other organizations, including the one that I work for, Schuylkill River Greenway's National Heritage Area. My name is Sarah Crothers, and I'm a member of the Watershed Congress Organizing Committee and the Education Director at Schuylkill River Greenways. I'm also the moderator for your session today, A Path to Equitable Water Infrastructure. I'm so happy to introduce our two speakers today. We have Catherine Baer. She's an environmental advocate for over 15 years and has worked for American Rivers Triangle Land Conservancy and the Upper Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, as for many other locations. She has led efforts to improve policies for clean and reliable water at local and state and national levels, including testifying before committees in Congress, serving on state and national working groups. She also holds a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Maryland, a Master of Arts degree in Conservation Ecology and Sustainable Development from the University of Georgia. We also have Colleen Walters with us today. She is with the River Network as their Delaware River Basin Program Manager. She focuses on clean water, the Clean Water Act education and engagement. Prior to the River Network, she worked for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Western Water Program. Colleen holds a Master of Science degree in Ecological Restoration from the University of Florida and a Bachelor of Science degree in Marine Sciences from the Coastal Carolina University. Thank you for bearing with me, everyone. I'm so happy to hear from Colleen and Catherine today, and I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to begin the presentation.
Wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. Great to be here. Sorry, I got the wrong slide here. Colleen and I are super excited to be here today, and we've got, I think, a really interesting presentation. So thanks for your interest in this topic, A Path to Equitable Water Infrastructure, where we're going to talk about our toolkit and how it could be applied in where you work, and really try to understand from everyone who's joining us today what is going on where you work in relation to this topic. So first of all, if you would be so kind as to put in the chat your name, your pronouns if you wish to, the organization if you are currently employed, and your lands that you are occupying, if you know them. And so I'll just start by introducing myself. I am Catherine Baer, I also go by KB, I go by she, her, and I work for River Network as Vice President of Programs. And I am joining you from North Carolina, which is the lands of the Eno and Shakori people. So now I'll turn it over to Colleen.
Hey everyone, I'm Colleen Walters. I work for River Network as well. I'm the Delaware River Basin Program Manager. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am located in Ambler, Pennsylvania on the lands of the Lenni-Lenape people.
Great, thank you, and thanks for everyone to introduce yourself in the chat. I'll just know who's here, and obviously it's Friday afternoon, small group. Let's keep it informal, and feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go along, and we will hear about them eventually. So what we're going to cover today is, first of all, some context and background about equitable infrastructure, its importance, why River Network we are working on this topic. Then we're going to talk about the toolkit, which we released. It's been a couple months now, so it's still a super new resource that's out there, and just kind of give you a step through on a high level of what's in it. So when you go back to it, you can have a chance to look at it in further detail and understand what's there. And then the second part of this presentation, we're really going to focus on the pathways for application, looking specifically at the State Revolving Loan Funds, which are big funds that come down from Congress to all of the states. And then kind of dive a little deeper in there, and then get some feedback from all of you about like what you know and what you've been working on in your state, and talk about end with really discussion together of what role does equitable water infrastructure have in your work, and what opportunities and needs do you see in your community and or watershed. So River Network, I think a lot of you, we know a lot of you, and a lot of you know us, but if you're new to our organization, we are a national capacity building organization. We connect over 8,000 groups and individuals around the country who are working for cleaner and healthier rivers. We're based out of Colorado, but have a small but mighty team all around the country. And we work on a number of, we're sort of a backbone organization, connecting people and working across issues, including drinking water, policy, community resilience, healthy rivers and agricultural landscapes, and leadership development. It's all underscored, underlaid by the need to create a more equitable and inclusive society and ensure clean and healthy waters for everybody.
Thanks, KB. So we wanted to start today by just sort of talking about our why, how this toolkit came about, and what some of our goals are in creating this toolkit. A lot of the impetus from for creating the toolkit came directly from our network. We have a wonderful network of members across the country, and they have been expressing a need and a desire to really understand what equitable infrastructure means, and not only what it means, but also how can they engage in it, how can they engage with their communities to provide more equitable infrastructure funding and opportunities for their communities. And so creating this toolkit, we are really thinking about how decisions are being made, what can we do to make water more affordable, how can we influence distribution of funding to be more equitable? It can be really confusing to dissect and to really understand where and how to plug in, but it's also really, really important for communities to engage and to be at the table to put the focus on the community, on equity, on sustainability for not just communities, but our rivers as well, of course. And so this toolkit is really made for all levels as well. You could be just coming in as a beginner, just wanting to get a better understanding of what infrastructure means, what infrastructure funding is, or you could be advanced. You could have been, working in this space for quite a few years. And so we really wanted to make sure that anyone who's reading this toolkit can take away some tools and resources and guidance from it. And it's also great timing, right? I think over the past year now, we've all heard the word infrastructure funding probably every day. And although, this toolkit is not focused on the current administration or the infrastructure bill that's coming down the line, it will help to give you all a better understanding of what infrastructure funding means, and also, when that funding does come through, how it'll flow down and how you can engage in that space. So the toolkit link is at the bottom of this slide right here, and we can share it in the chat a little bit later as well to make sure you have it. It's a free tool and open for everyone to use. Next slide, please. And so our definition, our working definition of equitable water infrastructure investment, those words, it's a mouthful. And we've been talking about those terms for a long time now, and we decided that in using this toolkit, we really wanted to create a definition, a working definition. This is River Network's definition, right? So it's not anything that's in the dictionary. And of course, others probably have other definitions that they're thinking of or other meanings when it comes to equitable water infrastructure. So if you have any other ideas or any other thoughts that come to mind while reading this definition or through this presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and let us know what you think equitable water infrastructure investment means. And so when we talk about it, we're talking about infrastructure dollars for clean water, drinking water, and stormwater, where there are one directed by the community, really getting to the local level impact. So directed by the community toward public health and clean, safe, affordable, and accessible water. Those terms are something that you are going to hear throughout the toolkit, really getting to equity, affordability, and accessibility, and where they're distributed in a way that supports low income and communities of color, those most at risk from environmental harms, those with a historic lack of investment, those that have been ignored and not been able to access the opportunities that this funding provides, and also supporting long-term sustainability of our waterways and water systems and utilities. So again, that's our definition. That's sort of how we have guided ourselves in this toolkit. And if you have any other thoughts, feel free to pop them into the chat. And next slide, KB. Awesome. So we're going to pause here for a poll. We are curious, sort of, who's in the room and what sort of level of knowledge you have coming into this presentation related to water affordability and infrastructure funding. So I'm going to launch this poll. So if you're a beginner, maybe not very familiar with the topic, this could be the first time that you're really thinking about what water infrastructure funding is. Intermediate, you've had some experience, but you're certainly looking to learn. Or advanced, you've had years of experience, you've dealt with this before. And like I said, this toolkit is really meant for everyone. And so if you're a beginner, if you're intermediate, or if you're advanced, we do hope that you will be able to find some impactful tools and resources here. All right, so it looks like we have 100% answering the poll. So I'm going to end it right here and share the results. So we have quite a bit of beginners, which is wonderful. I think I consider myself a beginner as well, still coming into this space. And so we're really glad that you are here, and we really hope that you'll be able to dive into this toolkit following the presentation. And we hope you get a lot out of it. All right, let me stop sharing here. We could go to the next slide, please. Awesome. So just to start with a general overview of the toolkit, we're not going to dive into really any major details, but we do want to give you an idea of what you might expect to learn when you're walking through the toolkit. So we do have 4 key sections that we focus on, that being utilities, infrastructure, affordability, and decision-making and influence. And within those 4 sections, we have graphs, we have case studies, we have quizzes, different elements to help you digest the information. And this toolkit, as I said, it's a free tool, it's online, it's downloadable. You can download the entire toolkit, or you can download sections at a time. The sections do speak to each other though. This, how we sort of have outlined it is just a way that we thought was most digestible. But they are certainly connected. All of those 4 key sections that I mentioned, they are going to speak to one another. But if you really want to dive into, say, infrastructure, you can just download the infrastructure section. And in the next couple of slides, I will walk through those 4 sections. KP, if you want to go to the next slide, thank you. So the first major section is utilities. And here we will speak to how water utilities are managed and regulated, how they operate, how they make decisions, and how do those decisions then impact water affordability. Talking about privately owned utilities versus publicly owned utilities, what sort of municipalities do they serve, how big is the area that they serve, those different factors and how they can really influence decisions and regulations. It'll also walk through how they fund their operations and receive financial oversight, how to explore and better understand different components of a water bill, how to assess and dissect the structure of a water bill to then identify potentially, areas where your utility could incorporate more equitable practices, and how to recognize for both utilities and customers to improve water affordability and equity outcomes, really pointing out ways to engage in equity. And it'll also end in recommended actions for both utilities and for individuals. For utilities, speaking to ways to improve asset management and pursuing funding. For individuals, how to really understand water utility governance to a point where you can be able to, communicate with them more impactfully, and then also how to undertake community relations and outreach efforts to get your community engaged as well. Next slide, please. So the next section is infrastructure. Infrastructure, I know, as I said earlier, is a very broad term and we've heard it every day. But this section is really going to be focused on the financial aspect of infrastructure. So how water system improvements are financed, how states play a role in administering federal funding, how that funding flows down to the local level, and then considerations for equity. And we'll also be getting diving more into the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. Catherine's going to take over in the next sort of part of this presentation and really dive into those SRFs. So I won't mention any more about that right now, but and as I mentioned previously, the sections do talk to one another. So you can't talk about infrastructure funding without mentioning affordability. This section, it'll highlight, for example, the effects that aging and neglecting water infrastructure have on water affordability, and then also some other program considerations that can achieve more affordable outcomes. Next slide, please. So leading us to affordability, of course. So the focus here is customer affordability and not utility affordability, even though they are obviously very connected, but the focus of this toolkit in this section is going to be customer affordability. And there are multiple ways to define affordability. So in this sense, we are speaking to households that can pay for water without having to sacrifice paying for other necessities, such as housing, transportation, other utilities, healthcare, food, education, all of those necessities. Sometimes low and fixed income households, they often have to face a choice of deciding between paying for their water or paying for other competing priorities, like other utility bills, other medical bills. So affordability in this sense is not having to make that decision and not having to sacrifice one or the other. So the section, it will discuss some considerations and consequences related to affordability, things like how population loss in an area no longer matches the infrastructure, or things like climate change and land loss impacts, and how those have effects on water infrastructure and water affordability. And it'll also speak to policies and practices at the federal, state, and local levels. Some of the things you might learn in this section, things like what causes water to be unaffordable, how governments and utilities can work together to make it more equitable, and how unaffordable water bills affect vulnerable populations, and how community members can influence decision-making related to water affordability. Which brings us to the next section, which is decision-making and influence. So certainly decision-making and influence is spread throughout these sections, but we definitely felt that it was important to also have a standalone section to really focus on the actions here. So to focus on the actions and also really reiterate the importance of community-directed implementation and really being at the table to speak to equity. And also how groups can build intersectionality between water infrastructure and other issues like health, housing, and economic vitality. When we speak about influence, we define it as the power to affect change at the local, state, or federal levels. Your utilities and your municipalities, they should have ways for you to communicate your water issues and your broader concerns, and so they can provide the solutions for you. And so this section will help you navigate that communication and provide practical sets of recommendations for learning more about local water infrastructure systems and pulling out factors that might compromise things like water affordability, equity, and sustainability. Also provides a list of action items to influence decision-making at federal, state, and local levels. So those are the four main sections of the toolkit, and certainly we hope you dive into them. And this was just a general overview, but KB, if you want to go to the next slide. We just wanted to pause here briefly if any of you all have any questions about the overview. And we're also curious, hearing those last few slides, how might you use this toolkit in your work? Do do you see elements that might come into play with the things that you do currently, or is this something that you are starting to think about, hoping to get into? We would love to hear it in the chat. I know that, the poll results, most of you were beginners, so perhaps you are just coming into the space and just learning about how you can engage in infrastructure and affordability. So if you have any thoughts on that, we'd love to hear them in the chat, or if you have any questions, we can pause for a couple seconds. If not, I can also toss it over to KB.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that was an awesome overview. And as we keep going, really keep this question front of mind, because, we're hoping that this toolkit will be helpful for people. So if you have a question of like, hey, is this topic covered? Or, if I have this question, how would I go in? Things like that, feel free to sort of ask us, and we'll put the link in later. And so even if next week or the week after, as you're taking a look at the document and have questions, feel free to give us an email. We'll provide you our contact information at the end of the session. So, okay, so with that, I then will keep going, and we're now gonna, as Colleen mentioned, we're gonna talk about one form of water infrastructure funding. And we're going to focus on what is called the State Revolving Loan Funds, which are the sort of largest source of water infrastructure funding coming from the federal government to the states and then to the local government. So we're going to focus there on basically what they are, why they're important, and sort of how they work, and then what are the applications to make them potentially more equitable if we were all to sort of advocate at our state level or state and local level to change the way they're used. So a lot of opportunities there, and so let's just jump right in. So to start to frame this out, as we talked about, the whole setting and idea of this toolkit is basically what can we do to restore equity, make things more equitable through water infrastructure investment. And so I want to start here. This is a recent report by the Environmental Policy and Innovation Center and the University of Michigan, came out just a month or so ago. And they basically analyzed funds over a 10-year period across the United States and the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund to try to figure out, well, how are these funds distributed? What are they used for? And what they found is really interesting. First, it was that only 7% essentially of the eligible drinking water systems have received assistance. And so that's a pretty small number given what a big pot of funding this is. And so the question is like, okay, why? And then the other finding related to that is that small communities and also more racially diverse ones are less likely to receive assistance. And so that's really important to know, so we can try to address that. And one thing about, the world of drinking water, which you all probably know, is there are so many drinking water systems out there. And so a lot of small ones that really do need help to sort of keep going, keep the lights on, making sure they're providing us all with water that's meeting safe drinking water standards. So if only the really small, this largest source of federal funds only reaching a small percentage of systems, and small systems and racially diverse ones are not as likely to receive funding, then we sort of all need to take a look and think about, okay, what can we do to make that right? So, okay, so for the overview, what are the state revolving loan funds and how do they work? So basically, if you, and hopefully, I don't know if you've heard about these before, but so at the federal level, the state revolving loan funds were created in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And essentially how they work is that now that they're authorized, every year Congress will appropriate funding. And so that can range from like hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, sometimes a year. So once Congress does that, then the money then flows to the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the agency that administers the fund. They set the guidelines and the rules based on the federal law, and then the money goes out to the states. So once it goes out to the states, one of the requirements is that states have to match with 20%. So if I'm a state, I'm in North Carolina, I get $100, I need to put in 20 to the pot, so the whole pot becomes bigger, and that's just always been the premise of them. Now, these are called revolving loan funds because it's a revolving fund because the idea set up here was that basically states were going to provide loans, very low cost, low interest, below market rate loans out to local governments, water utilities to pay for water infrastructure of different type. And then it would actually get paid back. So this was not set up as a grant fund. And in fact, it replaced a grant fund, which had kind of started in the 70s. So this was the new model of like, let's provide really low cost loans and encourage some best practices. The two funds are slightly different in terms of who can receive funding. So at the bottom of the slide, you can see some of the eligible entities, and the clean water include communities, private entities, NGOs, citizen groups. The drinking water side, similar community water systems, both publicly and privately owned ones, as well as nonprofit and non-community water systems. So big picture, that's sort of what the SRFs are about. Like I said, over time, there's been $145 billion provided from the federal government have flowed through this SRS to the states. And so one thing that's really important for us all to know is in terms of the way the law works, big picture, is that once it gets to the states, it's supposed to be a very public, transparent process of how this money gets spent. Sometimes hard to find, but states basically, they get this money every year, their annual amount, and they probably have a list of projects of drinking water systems, wastewater systems, stormwater systems that have applied for funding. And so states have to have what's called an intended use plan, which is a list of all of the projects that have come in the door wanting funding, basically. And then within that, they create a project priority list. And that's what's the top, ranked essentially for funding, 1 to however far they get. Now, what's important in there is that states have a lot of flexibility in how they prioritize what gets funded. And that's through the project priority list. And so they can use criteria like public health, sustainability, ability to pay, but also communities in need. They can look at poverty levels, violation of water quality standards. There's a lot of different things that one could put in that criteria. So it's interesting to compare states, how they're doing that. The states have that really freedom and flexibility to create their own process. And for all of us, it's required to have public review and comment. When I started working on SRFs, this was way back in the Obama administration, and we were working on the ARRA, the big stimulus package that Obama got through. There was a lot of money for water infrastructure. And when we started working with our state counterparts, we found that rarely were advocates looking at this list. It's just not something that, we as advocates typically do, like work with our finance agency to think about funding, but it is there. It's a big opportunity. All right, let me pause there. And before I go to the next slide. So next, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the two funds are slightly different. And so they're two different pots. So just so you can understand, there are some differences there. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So they differ by project type. What are the types of projects that can be funded? The allocation process, basically how much, when the money goes to the federal government and then moves over to the states, like how do they figure out how much each state or tribe gets? And then they each have some different programs set-asides, which are things in the law that Congress said, there's, hey, you get this money, most of it needs to go out the door to fund local projects, but there's also some things that we would think would be good that you can retain flexibility to set aside and use for more general purposes. Things like, for example, providing technical assistance to small community water systems, or providing environmental education and support for how to do a water loss audit. Just things that are like helpful to move up the bar in water infrastructure for the whole state, but means it's taking away from their pot of project funding. So starting with project type, this is something you might guess from the title of these funds, but the Clean Water SRF mainly does fund things related to what you would think of as clean water. So wastewater systems and non-point source projects, so things related to stormwater, play for wastewater treatment, but also green infrastructure and decentralized treatment. So things like bioswales and permeable pavement. can also pay for green roofs and wetlands, the things that naturally soak up water and help keep our rivers and streams and communities clean. So there's a lot of, it funds water reuse as well. And so a lot of different opportunities to fund different projects through the Clean Water SRF. On the drinking water side, which was created through the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1996, this really was designed to help water systems meet federal water regulations. So it tends to be a little bit narrow in scope. It's really about things related to drinking water treatment, the distribution, the pipes. Can also fund storage tanks, consolidation of systems, water efficiency, water loss, water conservation. And also Congress put a big emphasis that this fund can pay for source water protection. So to actually protect some of the land that drains into our drinking water sources. So a big range of projects in both those funds that can be funded. I think typically the projects end up to be what we might think of as more traditional projects, sort of like the wastewater, upgrading a wastewater system or paying for drinking water pipes. In recent years, there's been more emphasis and openness to looking at some of these more decentralized, distributed approaches that really can help the water infrastructure in our systems sort of go further for longer, thinking about water efficiency and water reuse and so forth. So it's interesting as you look at your state to say, hey, what are they funding? You know, what is really the range of project types they're looking at? So how do they decide what money goes to what state once it comes through the Fed? So there's two different allocation processes. On the drinking water side, the formula comes through the Safe Drinking Water Act. There's an infrastructure needs survey and assessment they do every so often. And so this showed for the most recent one that utilities need $472 billion. And as they do the survey, when the states demonstrate more need, they then receive a larger allocation of the fund. So, you know, however that's determined, I don't know exactly how the survey works, but when that survey comes through, something that, you know, you can look for is making sure that your state's participating, because the more they show a need, in theory, in the next allocation, their amount may actually bump up in terms of how much the state gets. And the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which comes from the part of the Clean Water Act that was amended in '87, the Clean Watersheds Needs Survey, there is a survey also on this side to figure out, hey, how much do we need for clean water in the country? But the actual appropriation amounts are written into the law of how much each state gets. So it's not as flexible, and often people like to fight about that how much each state gets, but it's been pretty fixed for a while. But each state does get some money, right? So if you go and look at it, you can see how much your state actually gets. So let's talk now really about how the state revolving loan funds can address equity. And so there's a couple different opportunities here just to know about and talk about as we talk about, like, what are the pathways that we could move forward with in different ways in our states. And so one is that priority setting process that I talked about. So states really do have the flexibility to set priorities and take advantage of that flexibility to provide benefit for low income communities. And so one way to do that is to look at different criteria that better indicate disadvantaged communities. So looking at things like what's the median household income, but other things, that's a pretty standard measure, but you can look at other things like what's the percentage of unemployment, or what's the average hourly wage in a community. And other things include percent of people who are unemployed or not in the labor force, percent of people living below poverty line, or people requiring cash assistance through other anti-poverty programs, or an age dependency ratio, or looking at communities often that have a population decline. So if you think about some of our places where people have left the cities and all of a sudden there's a big water infrastructure that we still need to support, but there's not as many ratepayers. That's when the rates go up and all of a sudden, like, the systems are struggling. So understanding and talking to your state agency about what criteria we're using? Why? Is there a way, are there ways? And ask yourself, are these the ones we should use? Could we use different ones? What do I see in my community that's not being addressed that the state could better address if they had different criteria that then might prioritize some of these needs that we see here? So that's a really important thing, is that priority setting process. Another thing to know is that under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, just that one fund, states are supposed to use 6 to 35%, somewhere in that ceiling, like a minimum of 6% of its allocation for what they call, what in the law is called disadvantaged communities. And that also states can have different ways of prioritizing and measuring disadvantaged communities. The Safe Drinking Water Act has not told the states exactly how to define that. So across the board, states define that differently. So that's within this priority setting. You can also think about how you define disadvantaged communities is another really important way to make sure funds are going more to help more people in need. Thinking back to that slide I showed you from the EPIC report, we're not really getting everyone yet. So that's one really thing. I'm gonna pause there. The other issue that's it's sometimes controversial, is making essentially the loans into closer to grants. Okay, and so this means basically they don't call them grants under this program because it's a loan fund, but they basically you can subsidize the interest rate enough or offer principal forgiveness that we're basically transforming what would be a loan to a small local government into a grant. So the reason to do that would be because a community really needs the funding because people are drinking contaminated water or the system's falling apart, right? And if the community's not able to pay it back, it could be a good choice to go ahead and transform that into a grant. The argument that people use against that is this, like, hey, this is set up as a loan fund, and if we start giving all the money away, like, we're just going to lose the capital, and the funds no longer revolve, and they just start declining over time. So there's a real balance there of how much funding in a state fund you can sort of grant versus loan. But it is, I think, a very important tool, especially now coming out of the pandemic when people are struggling, communities are struggling, and we're trying to support our water utilities and our ratepayers, our households, and our local community members. How can we structure what were loans and make them potentially into grants so they become more affordable for the communities. And you can do this for sort of a broad range of projects, or also use this to target funds for things that are more sustainable, like green infrastructure for stormwater and other processes that might have really a long-term benefit and help sustainability and affordability over the future. The third option that a lot of folks have been advocating for, and this recommendation comes from, again, the EPIC report, among other places, but is for states to use some of that funding that we talked about. There were the set-asides where states can sort of take a bunch of funding, and this could be additional funding from the federal government as well, or taking from the existing state funds, and providing technical assistance for smaller and low-income communities to apply, because these are not easy applications for sure, and they take, if you have a really small system where there's just sort of one or two employees, there just may not be the capacity to fill out the forms, the paperwork to actually even get in the system. And so that's been the case also. And so trying to find ways to support local systems by providing additional technical assistance, just so they can really get some applications in the door to become competitive for these loans or grants, can be really important. And some states have sort of tried that in different ways, but providing circuit riders and so forth. And so I think as all of us as advocates, that's another good recommendation to advocate for. So I'd say overall, many of you, as Colleen was saying, like, we're hearing about infrastructure so much, and I think a lot of our focus as advocates has often been increasing the overall amount of water infrastructure funding, which is absolutely needed, and we continue to do that. But then also thinking about how you influence the money once it does become available in these ways, to make sure it's prioritized and used in ways that can actually address equity and sustainability sort of in the long term, is going to be really important. So a quick case study, this is from the state of Michigan. And so just demonstrating how states can use some of their funds in a really flexible, creative way. And so as we all know, exposure to lead is not safe, and it's become an increasing problem around the country as we recognize that there are lead service lines out there for many households, affecting people's drinking water and making it unsafe to drink. So this is the case in Michigan, and so the state there allocated some additional money to match the State Revolving Loan Fund, $100 million, and then use that with the SRF funds to then provide supplemental grants to replace lead service lines throughout the communities. And so this made it so that the homeowners could have these lead service lines replaced, which are expensive for an individual on an individual basis, and made sure then the homeowners weren't burdened with the cost of paying for that replacement, and made sure the drinking water was safe. And so the state decided to just prioritize that year some of their drinking water state revolving loan fund to make that happen. They recognized the state as that was a priority. That this issue, so that's sort of an equity issue, because often it's, homeowners who can't afford to replace their lead service lines are living in a place where there are a lot of lead service lines, and often in low income and community of color, so most at risk from these health effects of lead. And other states have done that as well. Wisconsin has directed some lower interest rates and loan forgiveness for lead service line replacement. Indiana and New Hampshire also are now offering additional points in their priority plan for ranking projects. And New Jersey, I think, is also using principal forgiveness, so forgiving the actual loan for lead service line replacement for up to like 90% of project costs. So a lot of different ways that states can structure these to address equity issues that we're seeing in the community across the country now. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I can't see the questions in the chat, so I don't know if there are any questions or comments that have come in.
No, but I have some. I wanted to just sort of hear from you about, the criteria that you talked about, and maybe the ways you sort of think about how, like, the people watching this webinar might influence those criteria. And you gave some examples, the idea of determining where the money should go. Like, would you consider, looking at things like linguistic isolation as well as something that maybe would be a factor that is worth considering, possibly in identifying areas where that might need assistance? So just the idea of that, like, people could be thinking creatively and trying to come up with what is a way to identify those areas of need in their community. And then if they're coming up and thinking creatively about how criteria could be applied, how can people influence that in their region? I think we have a lot of Pennsylvanians here. I posted a link about Penvest. So I don't know if either of you wants to speak about, like, the second piece of that as well.
Yeah, and so without speaking about any states in general, so I think what you're asking is both like, how do I, as a community member, like, even think, like, where should water infrastructure go? And we'll sort of show you at the end, like, where to dig deeper in the toolkit to learn more exactly the different pieces you can think about looking at. But we're sort of, I think this is a ground up process. So this is thinking about, like, I live in my community, I work in my watershed, and what are my community members, what are the threats? Like, are we seeing a lot of local urban flooding that's not addressing, and therefore is there a way to work with our water utility to put in more green infrastructure? Or is the issue one of that basically we're having a major affordability problem in our community, and people's water is getting shut off, and we need to figure out a way to make rates affordable. And to do that, we need to invest in the drinking water system so the water utility has the funding they need to make things happen, and also making sure that we're avoiding water shutoffs. So I think, it really varies by community, and I wouldn't want to speak for anyone hear it all, but that's, we're working with an Equitable Infrastructure boot camp right now with groups around the country, and they're all bringing in their own, issues, and they're all different. Some people are looking at affordability issues. Some folks are trying to figure out, how do I influence my water board to use more water efficiency so people's water bills go down, and thinking about that, and then trying to understand, well, are these things eligible? How could they be funded more? Do they need more applications? Is that why they're not getting funded? Or is it because the criteria really is only favoring the upgrade of really big wastewater treatment plants? And it could be a number of things. So it's a lot to dig into, I would say. I don't mean to say this is an easy thing to do, but it's a great sort of opportunity, I feel like, in terms of where people can make a difference, and probably where we haven't collectively done like a lot of advocacy. So does that help?
Yes, I just wanted to check if Colleen had anything she wanted to add. Okay, you mentioned the boot camps, Catherine. Do you want to talk about that program? You said you've got one underway, and if there's anyone who's interested, are you going to be opening that opportunity in the future for others, and how would people look for that information?
Yeah, so we are in a boot camp right now with this the funding that got us. I'll come back to this in a sec, but this slide here shows how to stay informed for future events. We don't have any more boot camps planned right now, in part because we were looking for additional funding to be able to support both the groups and our staff time to do it. So we really hope to be able to come back to you and say, yes, we have these opportunities in the future. But so if you would like to keep up our events, including all of our training opportunities and RFPs to apply to these boot camps and others, rivernetwork.org/stay informed is the place to go.
Thanks for,
yeah.
Colleen is well, thanks for that, Catherine, and Colleen is popping some links into the chat there for people.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, Colleen.
Sure. Sure, yeah, I just wanted to make sure we've got the stay informed in there. And I can find it really quickly if it's not readily available, but we wanted to make sure you put in there the link as well to the toolkit itself. Does one of you have that readily available, or I can go pull that up?
Yeah.
Because it is like you said, that in a way, like, this is really quick dive into that. This is a really complicated subject. People are probably going to want to take a chance, get a chance to look into that much more in detail, and see what's in the toolkit. It's a great resource, so like I said, it does really seem like a lot of it is the concept of thinking creatively in areas where maybe leverage hasn't been applied, where advocacy hasn't been used in this particular just this idea of this level of funding, and recognizing, I know of a couple of projects in particular. I was kind of looking for some that I could kind of throw in there to give people an idea of what are some of the things that have been funded with some of that money in Pennsylvania, for example. And I can think of some fairly large sewage treatment plants that have been funded with some of those funds. So yeah, the idea of how I think it's helpful for people to kind of know and go look for, well, what is getting funded? And so like the decision making as far as how, because these are federal dollars. Do you want to talk at all about like that, and how the process by which the funds come from the state to the governments, and whether there's any ability to sort of for people to influence that?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite caught your question. You're talking about non-SRF funds? No,
but just if there's what is there a formula for how that, like, every state's its allotment? What is the formula for that? Like, you're talking about, thinking about the allotment for when you might influence in the state level. Is there an ability to influence whether a state is going to get more or less?
I think the allotments, my experience is the allotment, at least on the clean water side, was like a huge political fight because all the states start fighting with each other in Congress. And then they all decide that they're just not going to change it. So on the clean water side, I don't think that's a great place to spend your time. I mean, it's not, it'd be fine, but it's not, and all the states get something. And so I feel like there's probably my two places for advocates to work on would be like increasing the entire pie so everyone gets more, and then figuring out how, like, if there's any influence you want to have on how your state actually distributes the funding they get. Yeah.
When you're talking about the increasing the pie so that everyone gets more, and maybe this is something that you haven't been following, but the idea of the current infrastructure bill, is the pie possibly being increased? Is that something that could be coming?
Yeah, I think we're seeing, so in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and who knows what's going to happen to any of these, like Colleen was saying, like we're hearing a lot about infrastructure through bipartisan infrastructure bill and through the reconciliation process, and the coalitions that y'all work with in the Delaware are obviously really engaged in keeping up with that federal legislation and the Clean Water for All coalition. So those will increase the funding that is coming down, at least, for like a while, if they get passed through. And so there's going to be a lot of money coming through, and there'll be a lot of pressure, honestly, for states to use that funding. So to the extent that we can be at the table saying, this is great, we've got this funding, let's get it out there into things that are really high need, it'll be really important. The other thing, and not to be completely confusing, but also the one of the first COVID response bills in the American Rescue Plan, states and local governments got funding directly from the federal government and can use that funding for water, and they can use it for projects that are eligible under the SRF, but they don't have to be on the SRF list. We can share a blog with you where we've provided some resources about how that funding is working. And so that's another sort of immediate opportunity. And so I don't know where any of the Delaware Basin states or local governments are on that, but there are slugs of funding that are coming down that can also be used for water right now through that process. So Colleen, do we want to do the Menti real quick? Yeah.
Okay, so we do have some questions for the audience to get some information from you all, just to see sort of where you're at with this work. So thank you for putting that in the chat. So if everyone can go to menti.com and use that code right there, and I can share the question. So the first question is, how does equitable water infrastructure integrate into your work? And if you all want to pop that in, and I can share my screen and we can see some real-time responses here. And if folks are having trouble with the link, definitely let us know in the chat. So how do you all see equitable water infrastructure integrating into your work? Or, like I said, if you all are sort of just coming into this space, do you see an avenue for equitable water infrastructure? Anything like, getting involved in the SRFs or any of the other funding mechanisms, or working with community members to address affordability issues? Do you see any of that really in the communities that you work with? Potentially decreasing the trust and reliance on water packaged in single-use plastic, drinking water quality, addressing contamination. That's great. And let's go, just for the sake of time, we can go to the second question that we have here, which is, what opportunities and needs do you see in your community, in your watershed? So for example, work needed, there's work needed to connect the water supply and water quality with the water utility rates. Sewage treatment. Awesome. Well, feel free to continue to pop those in. I think we have a few concluding slides as well. So I can stop. Oh, wow, we have a lot more coming in. sewer systems to help solve flooding problems, community awareness of where water comes from, and health and safety. I think that's a huge, source water. Where does your water come from? I think that's a big question for a lot of communities. All right, so I am going to thanks all for participating. We appreciate your responses, and I can shoot it over to KB if we have some concluding slides.
Yeah, thanks. That Menti is fun to like gather people's thoughts. So just as we're wrapping up here, just for follow-up, like if you're interested in this topic and you go to the toolkit and you want to learn more about this, in the infrastructure section, you can sort of really read and take your time on how the SRF works. And then if you're looking to take action in the affordability section, there's more detail about like what are some of those different criteria you might use to actually prioritize equity and affordability. In the infrastructure section, information about how to advocate for how the state funds are spent. And then in this last decision and influence section that Colleen provided the overview for, it really goes in detail about like, hey, how do you review that state intended use plan, which is a big stack of online paper or something like that. So that's how you do it. That would be sort of the application and the pathway towards more equitable infrastructure focusing on the SRF at the state level.
Sarah, I think you have our outro.
So yeah, we got a final poll for you. What is the likelihood you apply the knowledge gained from this session? This really helps us to figure out, how we can better present and share this information with groups, especially online, which is never easy, but we appreciate any feedback you can give us. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. I will close out the poll. Okay, and hand it over to Sarah.
All right.
Thank you all for joining us today. That was a really wonderful presentation. Catherine and Colleen, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. And I'm excited to dive deeper into that toolkit that you presented. I want to just thank all of you for tuning in today and for being with us during this week of the Watershed Congress. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you in Pottstown 2022.